Forget the Hollywood myth. In 1870, a cowboy didn't just smell bad, he smelled like rotting meat that even starving wolves refused to eat. Imagine wearing a wool shirt for 3 months until it literally fused to your bleeding skin, and using a colony of angry ants as your only washing machine. But the true horror wasn't the filth, it was the cure. Stay tuned to discover why a thick crust of dirt was the only thing keeping these men alive, and how a simple bar of soap in Dodge City ended up killing more cowboys than a loaded revolver. If a modern person miraculously found themselves standing inside a bustling saloon in Dodge City during the sweltering summer of 1870, the first sensation to assault their senses would not be the threatening sight of gleaming revolvers or the raucous sound of a honky-tonk piano. Instead, they would be instantly overwhelmed by a dense, almost tangible wall of stench that made the eyes water and the stomach churn, a physical force that pushed against anyone entering from the fresh air of the street. This overpowering odor was the true and undeniable calling card of the Great Cattle Drive era, a suffocating mixture of biological emissions that hung in the still air of the room like a heavy, poisonous fog. It was a complex chemical cocktail composed of stale sweat that had fermented in wool for months, the sharp bite of ammonia, rotting leather gear, and the pervasive, earthy reek of dried cow manure. This miasma radiated from men who had not seen a bar of soap, a tub of hot water, or a change of linen for at least 3 punishing months while driving herds across the desolate plains. Medical historians and experts on frontier life assert that the biological aura surrounding a group of trail-weary drovers was so aggressive that it fundamentally altered the behavior of the local wildlife. Wild predators on the open prairies, including starving wolves and coyotes, often preferred to bypass these groups entirely, mistaking the living, breathing humans for decomposing corpses that had somehow retained the ability to ride horses. To the sensitive nose of a creature of the wild, a cowboy did not smell like prey, he smelled like advanced decay, a warning signal that suggested the meat was already spoiled and unfit for consumption. This sensory nightmare was not an accident of circumstance nor a sign of personal laziness, but the inevitable consequence of a brutal economic reality that forced men to abandon the most basic standards of civilization. When the massive herds began their slow, thunderous migration north from Texas toward the railheads of Kansas, the cowboys entered a harsh world where the scarcity of resources dictated a savage set of rules. In the strict hierarchy of needs on the trail, water was considered a substance more precious than gold dust, a vital resource rigorously reserved for keeping men and livestock alive under the relentless, baking sun. To waste even a single tin cup of this life-sustaining liquid on washing a face or rinsing a dust-choked shirt was viewed not merely as an unnecessary luxury, but as a criminal act of wastefulness bordering on insanity. A typical drover began his perilous journey with perhaps one spare change of clothes tucked deep into his saddlebags, but as the weeks ground on, that spare set often remained untouched or was worn over the first layer for warmth. The heavy woolen shirt he wore on the day of departure became a second skin, a trap for filth that absorbed every drop of nervous perspiration and every splatter of grease from the communal cooking pot. As the weeks turned into months, the fabric fused with the body's oils and the trail's grit, creating a hardened shell that trapped heat and bacteria against the flesh in a perpetual, fermenting cycle. The men eventually ceased to notice their own aroma, developing a collective olfactory blindness that allowed them to coexist in close quarters without retching, even as they became walking biological hazards. This was the unromanticized reality of the American West, a place where the heroes of the frontier were not the clean-shaven icons of cinema, but distinct entities of grime who carried the stench of 1,000 miles in their pores. At the precise moment the drovers guided the lead steers across the Red River and left the relative civilization of Texas behind, they unknowingly signed a physical and binding contract with absolute squalor. The vast, unforgiving expanse of the Indian Territory offered no quarter for the fastidious, and the men quickly understood that the rules of polite society had been suspended for the duration of the drive. In this harsh landscape, where the horizon stretched endlessly in a shimmering haze of heat, water ceased to be a tool for cleanliness and reverted to its primal definition as the sole sustainment of life. The unwritten constitution of the cattle trail was brutal in its simplicity. Every drop of liquid found in creeks or carried in barrels belonged first to the livestock, second to the horses, and last to the men. To use even a meager cupful of this precious resource to rinse the dust from one's face was not merely frowned upon as vanity, it was viewed as a direct threat to the collective survival of the crew. The trail boss, often a hardened veteran of the Civil War who knew the agony of thirst, enforced this discipline with a rigidity that bordered on religious zealotry, permitting no exceptions for comfort. In the dry seasons, when the watering holes turned into cracked mud pits and the rivers shrank to trickling streams, the idea of laundry became an absurd fantasy that no sane man would dare entertain. Consequently, the heavy woolen shirt and the thick cotton long johns a cowboy donned at the start of the drive became his permanent shell, a second skin that would not be removed for months. This single set of clothing was subjected to a daily barrage of environmental abuse that modern minds struggle to comprehend, beginning with the omnipresent, choking dust of the herd. From the moment the sun rose until it set, 2,000 hooves pulverized the dry earth into a fine, powdery grit that hung in the air like a solid curtain, penetrating every buttonhole and seam. This dust did not merely sit on the surface of the fabric, it worked its way deep into the weave, mingling with the body's natural moisture to create a gritty paste that coated the skin. As the midday sun beat down with relentless fury, the cowboy sweated profusely, his body desperately trying to cool itself beneath layers of heavy flannel designed to protect against brush and thorns. The sweat had nowhere to go, soaking into the already dust-laden fibers of the shirt until the garment was heavy, damp, and clinging to the torso like a wet shroud of misery. Over time, this cycle of sweating and drying created a complex chemical reaction within the clothes, as the salt from the perspiration crystallized and locked the dirt into the fabric structure. The wool, originally pliable and soft, began to undergo a grotesque transformation, losing its flexibility and stiffening into a hard, unyielding carapace that resisted the movements of the wearer. Grease from the communal frying pan, tallow used to treat leather, and the animal fats that permeated the air around the camp further saturated the material, acting as a binding agent for the filth. By the third week on the trail, a cowboy's shirt could literally stand on its own if placed on the ground, having retained the curved shape of its owner's back and shoulders in a rigid sculpture of grime. This hardened garment ceased to be clothing and became an instrument of torture, a coarse abrasive that rubbed relentlessly against the tender, sweltering skin underneath with every stride of the horse. The collar, now a ring of solidified salt and dirt, acted like a serrated blade against the neck, sawing back and forth with the rhythm of the gallop until the flesh was raw and weeping. Under the arms and between the thighs, where the friction was constant and the heat intense, the stiffened fabric acted like coarse sandpaper, stripping away the upper layers of the epidermis. The pain of this constant chafing was sharp and stinging, a background noise to the day's labor that eventually dulled into a throbbing ache as the nerve endings became desensitized. Open sores often formed at the pressure points, weeping clear fluid and blood that only served to further glue the abrasive fabric to the wound, creating an agonizing cycle of tearing and scabbing. When a cowboy finally lay down in his bedroll at night, he did not dare remove his clothes, for the cool night air would make the sweat-soaked wool freeze, and peeling it off would rip the scabs. Instead, he slept in his armor of filth, allowing the dried crust of the day to crack slightly as he shifted in his sleep, only to have the wounds reopen and bleed afresh when he mounted up at dawn. The accumulation of bodily salts became so extreme that on particularly hot days, white rings would appear on the outside of the shirts, mapping the topography of the wearer's suffering for all to see. This visible map of sweat was accompanied by the sensation of thousands of tiny, sharp crystals grinding against the skin, creating an itch that could not be scratched because it was everywhere at once. Any attempt to scratch through the thick, matted fabric was futile, and reaching under the shirt only introduced more dirt from the hands into the raw, inflamed pores of the torso. The fabric became so impregnated with organic matter that it began to rot while still on the body, yet it held together through the sheer cohesive power of the grease and dirt that saturated it. In the rare event of a rainstorm, the situation worsened, as the dried crust would dissolve into a caustic slime that slid down the body, burning the raw abrasions like acid before drying hard again. The cowboys learned to move with a certain stiffness, limiting their range of motion to minimize the friction of their clothes, walking and riding with a rigid posture dictated by their laundry. This physical restriction changed the way they worked, forcing them to turn their entire bodies rather than just their heads, to avoid the razor-sharp bite of the stiffened collar against their burnt necks. To the outside observer, they looked like stoic figures of endurance, but in reality, they were prisoners within their own garments, trapped in a slow-motion flame caused by their own hygiene. The localized infections that arose from this constant abrasion were common, treated only with a dab of whiskey or a smear of axle grease, primitive remedies for a sophisticated form of torture. Even if a stream with ample water was found, the fear of shrinking the wool prevented many from washing, for a shrunken shirt on the trail was a disaster that could cut off circulation or restrict breathing. Thus, the filth was rationalized as a protective layer, a necessary shield against the sun and the insects, a justification that allowed the men to endure the sensation of being encased in grit. The romantic image of the cowboy riding freely across the plains betrays the tactile reality of a man whose clothes were slowly eating him alive, a prisoner of the very fabric meant to protect him. By the time the herd crossed into Kansas, the distinction between the man and his clothes had blurred, the fabric was ingrained into the skin, and the skin had grown into the fabric. Removing these garments at the end of the drive would require soaking in hot water just to loosen the bond, a painful excavation of the human form from the geological strata of the trail. This was the price of the beef that fed the nation, 1,000 miles of friction, salt, and silence, borne by men who had forgotten the feeling of clean cotton against unblemished skin. By the time the drive dragged its weary length into the middle of the second month, the physical torment of the stiffened clothing was eclipsed by a far more insidious and maddening plague. The drovers found themselves under siege by an invisible army that lived within the very seams of their apparel, a pestilence that the men of the frontier grimly christened with the nickname graybacks. These were body lice, resilient and voracious parasites that thrived in the warm, humid microclimate created between the cowboy's sweating skin and his unwashed layers of wool and cotton. Initially, the infestation would begin as a subtle, almost unnoticeable irritation along the waistline or under the collar, easily dismissed as heat rash or the prickling of coarse fabric. However, within a matter of days, the biology of the louse asserted itself with terrifying speed, as the heat of the human body provided the perfect incubator for their rapid reproductive cycles. A single female louse could lay dozens of eggs a day, cementing them to the fibers of the shirt with a glue-like secretion that was impervious to sweat, friction, or casual brushing. Soon, the solitary itch transformed into a sensation of perpetual motion, as if the skin itself had detached from the muscle and begun to crawl on its own accord across the drover's back. The psychological toll of this infestation was often more damaging than the physical drain, as the constant, rhythmic biting denied the men any chance of true, restorative sleep. Lying in their bedrolls under the stars, exhausted from 18 hours in the saddle, the men would twitch and thrash, their hands unconsciously tearing at their own flesh in a futile attempt to stop the feast. The sound of fingernails rasping against canvas and skin became the nocturnal soundtrack of the camp, a gritty rhythm that replaced the snoring of the earlier weeks with the noise of restless misery. When the itching grew so intense that it threatened to unravel a man's sanity, driving him to fits of temper that endangered the herd, the cowboys were forced to resort to the only remedy available in the wild. It was a solution born of desperation and crude ingenuity, a method of disinfection that would strike a modern observer as a form of medieval torture rather than a hygiene practice. The ritual usually took place at high noon, when the sun was at its zenith and the column had paused for a brief rest, provided the terrain offered the specific tool required for the job. The men would skin the ground not for water, which was absent, but for the large, mounded earthworks of the red harvester ant, a creature known for its aggression and voracious appetite for protein. Upon finding a suitably massive anthill, teeming with thousands of insect soldiers, the afflicted cowboy would step away from the group and begin the humiliating process of stripping down. He would peel the stiff, filth-encrusted layers of his shirt and trousers from his body, hearing the crackle of dried sweat as the fabric separated from the sores it had adhered to. With a mixture of hope and revulsion, he would cast his garments directly onto the swarming mound, disturbing the colony and triggering an immediate, violent defense response from the ants. The insects would surge forth from their subterranean tunnels, swarming over the foreign object that had blocked their sunlight, and immediately detect the presence of the lice hiding in the seams. To the ants, the graybacks and their eggs were a rich and easily accessible source of food, and they began a ruthless systematic extermination of the parasites within the fabric. The cowboy would stand naked in the blistering heat, watching as the red tide consumed his clothes, trusting nature's scavengers to pick the seams clean of the vermin he could not reach. But the cleansing of the clothes was only half the battle, for the lice eggs, known as nits, were often glued directly to the body hair and the layers of dead skin on the man himself. Without water to wash them away, the drover had to rely on mechanical friction to scour his own body, turning to the abrasive qualities of the landscape itself to flay away the filth. He would grab handfuls of coarse river sand or dry, grit-filled earth and scrub his chest, arms, and groin with a violence that turned the skin a bright, angry red. The sharp grains of sand acted as a primitive exfoliant, grinding away the top layer of epidermis along with the sweat, grease, and the clutches of eggs that clung to the hair follicles. For the areas where the dirt was matted too thickly or the calluses were too deep, the cowboy would draw his hunting knife, not to cut, but to scrape, Using the dull spine of the blade or a knife kept deliberately blunt for camp chores, he would drag the steel across his skin in long, firm strokes, like a carpenter planing a rough piece of lumber. The knife would collect a gray, putty-like substance, a sickening mixture of dead skin cells, sebum, crushed lice, and road dust that had accumulated over months of neglect. This process was painful, leaving the skin raw and weeping, but the stinging sensation of the air hitting the abraded flesh was a euphoric relief compared to the maddening itch of the parasites. The drover would continue this dry bath until his skin felt raw and sensitive, a signal that he had stripped away enough of the outer layer to remove the majority of the infestation. Meanwhile, on the anthill, the cleaning crew would be finishing their work, having picked the seams of the shirt and the crotch of the trousers free of living lice and edible nits. Retrieving the clothes required a delicate dance, snatching the garments up quickly and shaking them violently to dislodge the angry ants before they could turn their mandibles on the men. Putting the clothes back on was a grim necessity. The fabric was still stiff with old sweat and smelled of the earth, but for the first time in weeks, it was quiet. The shirt no longer felt like a living thing against the back, and the trousers ceased to bite into the legs, offering a fleeting sense of peace that felt like the height of luxury. This respite was temporary, of course, lasting perhaps a week before the few surviving eggs hatched or contact with another drover restarted the cycle of infestation all over again. Yet, in the context of the long drive, that single week of relief was worth the indignity of standing naked in the wilderness and scraping one's own hide with a steel blade. It was a testament to the extreme adaptability of the frontier spirit, where men learned to weaponize one aspect of the hostile environment to defeat another. They accepted the pain of the scraping and the danger of the ants as a fair price to pay for a few nights of unbroken sleep, bargaining their comfort with the brutal currency of the plains. Thus, the anthill became as vital a landmark as the watering hole, a station of cleansing where the food chain was briefly manipulated to serve the sanitation needs of the unwashed. As the group remounted and the herd began to move again, the air of the drag carried the scent of disturbed earth and raw skin, the smell of men who had literally scraped the past month off their bodies. As the relentless march of the cattle drive pushed deeper into the scorching heart of the summer, a profound and disturbing physiological change began to overtake the men. The frantic, scratching desperation of the earlier weeks gradually subsided, replaced by a numb acceptance that signaled the final surrender of the civilized human to the wild environment. Dirt was no longer a foreign contaminant to be scrubbed away or fretted over, it had ceased to be an external problem and had become an integral part of the cowboy's anatomy. A terrifying transformation took hold as the accumulation of dust, dead skin cells, and animal grease ceased to be a coating and calcified into a permanent, living layer of armor. The boundary between the men and the elements dissolved, replaced by a thick, dark patina that smoothed over the features of the face and filled the deep lines etched by squinting. This was the formation of the trail crust, a phenomenon that old hands on the drive spoke of not with disgust, but with a strange reverence born of practical necessity. The mixture of sweat and fine prairie silt acted like a primitive cement, sealing the pores of the skin and creating a barrier that was remarkably effective against the harsh conditions. Under the merciless glare of the midday sun, where a fresh-faced city dweller would have blistered and peeled within an hour, the encrusted cowboy rode on with impunity. The layer of grime functioned as a highly effective sunblock, a physical shield that absorbed the ultraviolet radiation before it could penetrate to the vulnerable pink flesh beneath. Men who had started the drive with fair complexions were now uniform statues of mahogany and gray, their skin protected by the very filth that polite society would have shunned. This accidental adaptation went beyond mere sun protection, it fundamentally altered the way the drovers interacted with the plague of insects that haunted the open plains. The horseflies of the territory, vicious creatures with mandibles capable of drawing blood through a cotton shirt, found themselves baffled by this new, hardened species of mammal. When a fly landed on a veteran drover's arm, its biting apparatus would struggle to find purchase on the leathery, callus-like surface that covered the blood vessels. The insect would probe and scrape, attempting to drill through the strata of dried mud and sebum, only to give up and fly off in search of a softer, cleaner victim to torment. For the cowboy, this was a revelation. The layer of dirt that had once caused such intense itching had now suffocated the nerve endings and provided a wall of silence against the pests. He had become encased in a biological fortress, a shell that allowed him to exist in a hostile ecosystem without constantly swatting, bleeding, or suffering the sting of venom. This physical hardening was accompanied by a psychological shift, a complete inversion of the values regarding hygiene that the men had brought with them from their homes. In the warped logic of the trail, a clean face began to look unnaturally naked, a sign of vulnerability and softness that suggested a man was not pulling his weight. To see a patch of white skin was shocking, almost obscene, like seeing an open wound that invited infection and pain, whereas the dark crust signified resilience and competence. The men began to view their own odor not as a stench, but as a neutral fact of existence, a background radiation that was no more offensive than the smell of the sagebrush or the dust. This olfactory blindness facilitated a deeper, almost mystic union between the rider, his mount, and the massive, lowing herd that moved like a slow river across the landscape. The distinction between man and beast began to blur, not just metaphorically, but in a very literal, biological sense that could be smelled from a mile away. The horse, sweating profusely under the saddle, produced a foam that soaked into the cowboy's chaps and trousers, mingling with the rider's own perspiration to create a single chemical signature. A rider spending 16 hours a day in the saddle absorbed the essence of the animal, and the animal, in turn, was coated in the salty residue of the man. They became a centaur-like organism, moving with a single will, sharing the same layer of dust, the same thirst, and the same profound, earthy aroma. This blending extended to the cattle, whose pungent ammonia scent and clouds of dander became the atmosphere in which the cowboys lived, breathed, and slept. Predators and game animals downwind could no longer distinguish the scent of the human hunter from the harmless smell of the wandering herd. The cowboy had successfully camouflaged himself within the biology of his charges, disappearing into the collective organism of the drive until he was just another moving part of the mass. It was a survival mechanism that dated back to the dawn of hunting, a suppression of the human self to become one with the environment, achieved through the absolute rejection of soap. The very concept of water touching the skin became alien, a distant memory of a life that felt weak and fragile compared to the callous existence of the trail. Veterans of the drive claimed that washing off the protective layer before the end of the journey was actually dangerous, a shock to the system that could invite fever or chill. They believed the dirt held the body together, keeping the core temperature stable and sealing in the vital fluids that would otherwise evaporate into the dry air. This superstition reinforced the behavior, turning the avoidance of bathing into a conscious strategy for health preservation rather than a mere lack of opportunity. The cracks in the mud on a man's cheek when he smiled were the only breaks in the armor, revealing the pale, untouched skin beneath like a glimpse into a geode. These rare flashes of the original human underneath served only to highlight how complete the transformation had been, emphasizing the thickness of the mask they wore. The filth had weight, a physical presence that pressed against the skin, grounding the men, making them feel heavier and more substantial against the vast emptiness of the horizon. They moved with the slow, deliberate economy of creatures who were weighed down by their own environment, their stiffened clothes and coated skin limiting unnecessary gestures. In this state, they were impervious to the minor scratches of mesquite thorns, which simply skidded off the hardened mixture of clay and sweat without drawing blood. They were protected from the chafing of the rope, the bite of the wind, and the scorching touch of hot metal, insulated by the very grime that defined their degradation. It was a grim paradox. To survive the purity of the wilderness, one had to become impure, to construct a shield out of waste and refuse to keep the lethal beauty of nature at bay. By the 4th month, the cowboy was no longer a visitor in the wild, he was a piece of the terrain that had learned to ride a horse, a sculpted lump of the prairie itself. He had achieved a state of equilibrium with the filth, where the dirt on his skin was indistinguishable from the ground he slept on, and the boundary between man and earth had vanished. The arrival of the herd at the chaotic, mud-choked railheads of Abilene or Dodge City marked the official termination of the arduous drive, a moment that was supposed to symbolize triumph and relief. For the weary drovers, who had been defined by motion and solitude for months, the sight of the wooden buildings and the sound of the train whistle promised a return to the comforts of humanity. This transition was centered around a specific, almost sacred ritual of restoration, where the cowboy sought to strip away the accumulated grime of the wilderness and reclaim his identity as a civilized man. He would ride straight to the barbershop or the back of a hotel, clutching his hard-earned pay, dreaming of the sensation of hot water dissolving the thick, hardened carapace that covered his skin. However, the reality that awaited him in the bathing rooms of the frontier towns was a grotesque mockery of cleanliness, a hygiene disaster that was often more dangerous than the trail itself. In these boomtowns, located on the high plains where wells were deep and hauling liquid was labor-intensive, fresh water was a commodity that commanded a price often higher than whiskey. Heating enough water to fill a large wooden tub required expensive firewood or coal, making a fresh, steaming bath a luxury that was economically impossible for the establishment to provide for every customer. The proprietors of these bathhouses operated on a ruthless margin of efficiency, establishing a system where the water in the tub was viewed as a reusable asset rather than a disposable resource. On a busy Saturday, when hundreds of drovers flooded the town simultaneously, the large copper or wooden tub would be filled in the morning and might not be drained until late that night. The first customer of the day, usually the one with the most coin or the earliest arrival, enjoyed the singular privilege of clear, hot water that actually performed the function of cleaning. But as the day progressed, a steady procession of 20, 30, or even 40 men would climb into that same vessel, each one depositing his personal collection of prairie filth into the solution. By the time the average cowboy secured his turn in the late afternoon, the liquid in the tub had undergone a horrifying transmutation, losing all characteristics of water save for its wetness. It had thickened into a viscous, opaque sludge, a gray-brown soup suspended with clumps of buffalo grass, cow manure, road dust, and the molted layers of human skin. The surface of this tepid broth was often coated with a shimmering, iridescent film of grease and oil, the rendered fat of a dozen different men floating like an oil slick on a stagnant pond. Floating amidst this debris were mats of matted hair, discarded scabs that had soaked loose from old wounds, and the drowned corpses of the lice and ticks that had been scrubbed off the previous occupants. Yet, the exhausted cowboy, blinded by the desire to feel wetness against his skin and deceived by the dim lighting of the room, would step into this biological hazard without hesitation. He would lower his body into the nutrient-rich culture, letting out a sigh of relief as the warmth penetrated his aching muscles, unaware that he was immersing himself in a medical nightmare. The heat of the water, while soothing to the joints, served a far more sinister purpose by opening the pores of the skin wide, creating thousands of tiny entry points for infection. Instead of washing away impurities, the bath became a mechanism for absorption, where the cowboy soaked in a concentrated solution of every disease and bacteria carried by his predecessors. This was not a bath in the modern sense, it was a massive exchange of microflora, a communal mixing bowl where the pathogens of the frontier were shared with democratic efficiency. If the men who bathed 3 turns prior had been suffering from a weeping syphilis chancre, the spirochetes were now swimming freely in the suspension, searching for a new host. Skin infections, fungal colonies from rotting boots, and fecal bacteria from the bowels of men suffering from dysentery swirled together in a toxic cocktail that coated every inch of the bather. The cowboy would take a coarse sponge or a rag, already gray with use, and vigorously scrub this fluid into his face, rubbing the dissolved waste of strangers into his eyes and mouth. He believed he was scrubbing away the trail, but in reality, he was trading the honest, sterile dirt of the earth for the dangerous, septic filth of crowded humanity. The bar of soap, often a harsh block of lye that burned the sensitive areas, was passed from hand to hand, becoming a slimy vehicle for transferring ringworm and lice eggs between customers. As the cowboy sat there, soaking for the allotted 20 minutes, the water cooled, and the suspension of grime began to settle on him like a second skin, finer and more lethal than the dust he had lost. The psychological effect of the bath was powerful. The man felt clean because the stiff, abrasive armor of the trail was gone, and his skin felt soft from the soaking and the lye. He did not realize that this softness was partly due to the layer of human grease he had coated himself in, a biofilm harvested from the bodies of the men who had ridden in before him. This shared water was a perfect incubator, kept at a tepid temperature in a humid room, allowing bacterial colonies to multiply at an exponential rate between the morning and the evening. Medical historians note that outbreaks of boils, impetigo, and mysterious fevers often swept through these towns, tracing their origin not to a contaminated well, but to the bathhouse tub. The water became so thick with sediment that by the evening, a man could not see his own knees beneath the surface, sitting instead in a dark, churning darkness that smelled of wet dog and ammonia. Occasionally, the proprietor might add a bucket of boiling water to the mix to raise the temperature, stirring the sediment and reanimating the bacterial soup for the next paying victim. For the cowboy, the sensation of the grit sliding off was ecstatic, a physical release of the burden he had carried, blinding him to the fact that he was marinating in waste. He would scrub his hair with the same water, matting his scalp with the oils of others, ensuring that the ringworm or lice of a stranger were planted firmly at the roots of his own follicles. When he finally stood up to exit the tub, the water would sheet off him in heavy, dark rivulets, leaving behind a microscopic residue of pathogens that began to dry on his skin immediately. He would step out onto a wooden floor that was slick with the same splashes of contaminated water, tracking the fungus of 100 other feet into his freshly cleaned toes. The tragic irony of the frontier bath was that the cowboy was often biologically safer when he was encased in his dry, hermetic crust of mud on the open plains. There, the sun and the dry air acted as natural sterilizers, keeping bacterial growth in check, whereas the bathhouse provided the warmth and moisture that disease required to flourish. He walked out of the bathhouse feeling reborn, his skin pink and tingling, unaware that he was now a walking petri dish, colonized by the invisible legacy of every drifter in Kansas. This ritual of purification was, in fact, a game of Russian roulette played with microbiology, a testament to the dangerous illusion that clear water and visible dirt are the only measures of cleanliness. The final insult awaited him in the form of the drying cloth, but the bath itself had already done the work of preparing his body for the silent, creeping killers of the civilized world. The ultimate and most biting irony of the American frontier lay not in the open prairies, but in the very establishments designed to offer comfort and renewal to the weary traveler. History records that thousands of young men survived the perilous journey north, navigating a gauntlet of lethal hazards that would have broken lesser spirits. They had successfully dodged the arrows of hostile Comanche raiding parties, swum their horses across swollen rivers capable of crushing a man against the rocks, and survived the thunderous terror of midnight stampedes. Yet, after conquering the raw brutality of nature for 3 months, a staggering number of these hardened survivors found their demise in the quiet, unassuming corners of a barbershop or a bathhouse. The grim statistical reality of the 1870s reveals that for many drovers, the transition from the wild to the civilized was not a salvation, but a death sentence executed by invisible assassins. The most common instrument of this destruction was the communal towel, a ubiquitous fixture in every hotel room and public washroom from San Antonio to Dodge City. Often known as a roller towel, this continuous loop of fabric hung on a wooden roller on the wall, available for the use of every patron who passed through the door. By the time a cowboy reached for it to dry his freshly scrubbed face, the fabric had been used by dozens of strangers to wipe away their own grime, mucus, and blood. The fibers of the towel were a thriving ecosystem of pathogens, damp and warm, harboring the bacteria responsible for everything from simple pink eye to deadly streptococcal infections. When the cowboy rubbed this cloth vigorously against his skin, particularly over the microscopic abrasions caused by the harsh lye soap, he was effectively inoculating himself with a lethal culture. The very act of drying off became a biological transfer, planting the seeds of erysipelas or sepsis directly into the bloodstream of a man whose immune system was already taxed by exhaustion. Even more deadly was the morning ritual at the barber's chair, a place that served as the social hub of the town but operated as an unregulated surgery for the spreading of blood-borne diseases. The straight razor, the symbol of the gentleman, was a tool that required constant honing and stropping to maintain its edge, yet it was rarely, if ever, sterilized between customers. A barber in a rush to service the long line of payday customers would simply wipe the blade and the foam on a rag tucked into his belt or, more often, directly onto the leg of his trousers. This fabric, stiff with the dried blood and pus of 100 previous shaves, acted as a reservoir for viruses and bacteria that could survive outside the body for hours or even days. When the razor inevitably nicked a pimple or sliced a mole on the cowboy's chin, the barber would not stop to disinfect the wound, for the concept of germs was still largely alien to the frontier. Instead, he would reach for the styptic pencil or the alum block, a chalky white stick used to cauterize small cuts and stop the bleeding immediately. This same stick had been pressed against the bleeding cuts of every other man in the town, absorbing the fluids of the infected and transferring them directly into the open vein of the next victim. It was through this efficient delivery system that syphilis found a new route of transmission, bypassing sexual contact entirely to infect men through the innocent act of a shave. The barber's itch, often dismissed as a minor rash, frequently masked the early stages of systemic infections that would slowly rot the body from the inside out over the coming years. However, it was the rapid-acting sepsis that claimed lives with a speed that terrified the local doctors, who were powerless to stop the progression of the blood poisoning. A cowboy who had ridden into town on Friday, full of life and boasting of his adventures, could be delirious with a raging fever by Sunday evening, his neck swollen and red. The bacteria, introduced through a minor razor burn or a contaminated bath, would multiply with terrifying velocity, turning the body's own circulatory system into a highway for toxins. The tragic paradox was that the thick, repulsive layer of dirt and grease that the cowboy had scrubbed off had actually been keeping him alive on the trail. That hardened crust had sealed his skin against minor cuts, prevented insect bites, and created a hostile environment for the bacteria that thrived in the moisture of the town. By scrubbing himself raw in the bath and submitting to the razor, he had stripped away his armor and exposed his vulnerable, sun-thinned skin to a concentrated assault of civilization's filth. He would lay in a hotel bed between sheets that looked white but had likely not been boiled since the last occupant died in them, sweating out his life in a room that smelled of lavender and decay. The friends who gathered around his bedside were often baffled, unable to comprehend how a man who had wrestled longhorn steers could be felled by a swollen jaw or a red streak on his arm. They watched in helpless silence as the gangrene set in or the fever burned away his mind, witnessing a death that lacked the glory of a gunfight or the drama of a riding accident. These deaths were quiet, confused, and agonizingly slow, taking place indoors where the air was still, a stark contrast to the violent but quick deaths of the open range. Historical records from the burial grounds of the cattle towns show a disproportionate number of young men who died of blood poisoning or lockjaw shortly after the end of a drive. It is a haunting testament to the ignorance of the era, where the pursuit of gentlemanly appearance was a game of Russian roulette played with invisible bullets. The clean white shirt, the smooth chin, and the smell of bay rum were the uniform of the corpse, the final costume of a man who had survived the impossible only to be killed by the mundane. In the end, the true predator of the Wild West was not the grizzly bear, the rattlesnake, or the outlaw, but the microscopic killer lurking on the rim of a shaving mug. The civilization that the cowboy helped to build by driving beef to the markets ultimately consumed him, using the tools of hygiene to accomplish what the wilderness could not. As the coffin was lowered into the dry earth of Boot Hill, it contained not just a man, but the shattering of a myth, proving that in the taming of the West, a bar of soap could be more lethal than a Colt 45.